Hi, we're going to talk about a type of implied term into a contract, specifically consumer rights. So when we create contracts, there will be some terms that we expressly make, and there will also be some which the law automatically puts in there for us. So we don't have to request for these terms to be part of our contract. It's implied that they already will be. So when it comes to our consumer rights, these are really important and something that it's really useful to know about, not just for exams, but for everyday life, because it will have a huge impact on our understanding of the things that we buy. Few things just to break down and to really understand when it comes to consumer rights is that you need to be good with your definitions and really clear on what different things count as. So the first definition that you need to be confident about is the difference between goods and services. This is because different laws and different rules apply to different things. So, for example, goods are usually seen as things that are tangible. When you buy a sandwich, when you buy a drink, if you buy a new pair of trainers, most of the things that we buy as goods are things that we have to hold. And you'll buy plenty of these every day, I'm guessing. Services, of course, is when you're paying someone to do something for you, and that's often something that's more intangible, but it can include goods. So for example, you could have a service which doesn't have any sort of tangible goods outcomes, such as a haircut. So you are paying someone to cut your hair. You don't really have a haircut as such to take away with you. But for example, if you hire a plumber to fix your washing machine, they may fix it, but they may also install new parts as part of that. And that would be goods. So the first thing that you need to do is to determine whether the person is complaining about goods or services. Then you need to have a look at who the people are involved in the transaction. The law separates into consumers and traders, especially under the new Act. That is the terminology you should be using. So if you're a consumer, then you are acting wholly or mainly outside of your business, trade or profession. So essentially you are buying things that are generally for your own purpose. Now, if you occasionally use them for business reasons, that would be okay, wholly or mainly outside of your business. So for example, if a teacher buys some stationery and may jot something down after a work phone call, that's certainly going to be a consumer and a consumer transaction. Now, a trader is someone who is acting for their business, trade or profession. So they're generally selling something as part of that. So for example, your hairdresser would be charging people for haircuts as part of their business, trade or profession. And that also includes, for example, if you're running businesses from home. So if you have an eBay store, that would count as well, for example. When it comes to traders, it could be that you are the trader or you could be acting on behalf of that person. So for example, if you're a sales assistant in a shop, you would be selling people things as part of your profession. Next thing we have to have a look at then is, based on these definitions, who is the contract between? Who is the relationship between? Different rules, different laws apply to different types of relationship. So the most recent law is the Consumer Rights Act 2015. This was a consolidating act which brought together pieces of other laws, mostly from the Sale of Goods Act and the Supply of Goods and Services Act. Now, because it only applies to consumer and trader, we do still have to look at some of the older laws if it's a relationship between those people. So for example, if you have a trader, so for example, perhaps it's back to the hairdresser and they are bulk buying shampoo or hair dye for their salon, they would be acting as a trader buying from another trader. So the old laws would apply. Now here it's really important that you understand the difference between goods and services, because different acts apply to those. If you are buying goods, then you're covered by the Sale of Goods Act 1979. If it's services, you're covered by the Supply of Goods and Services Act 1982. Now, the main reason that it's called that is because supply of goods and services, as we said before, some services will include goods within that. So the Supply of Goods and Services Act does cover situations like those as well. So the last relationship that you might have is between consumers. So this is where you have people who aren't selling as part of a business, selling to other people. Now, the only general rule here is caveat emptor, which generally translates to buyer beware. And that means that you don't really have many rights when you buy from someone else, as long as there's no kind of fraud or duress involved. Generally, you buy what you see. So, for example, if you're buying an old phone from a friend, it's generally you have to take it as you see it. If it goes faulty the next day, you don't really have any legal rights, although as a friend, you might want to honour that. The most important relationship, however, is consumer and trader. You're unlikely to get consumer and consumer in the exam, for example. Now, before we look at actual rights, what happens if those rights are found to be broken? Again, this is why it's important that you know the difference between goods and services, because different remedies apply to whether it's a good or service. So if it's goods, then we kind of follow a bit of a flow chart going on. So generally we start with a right to a refund, particularly if it's within 30 days. We call this a right to reject, and it's under section 20 of the Consumer Rights Act, which I've written all in blue. If it's beyond that, it might be the right to repair or replace. So what we have here is that it's up to the trader to decide what's best for them. They can either repair the item at no cost, or they can replace it completely. So, for example, if it's something that is quite old, it might be easier and cheaper just to provide them with a replacement. So, for example, if it's like a phone, you might just give them the newer model. However, it might be more suitable just to try and repair it. So if it's, for example, if it's a shop, they may offer to put the buttons back on themselves, for example. When it comes to the final right, a right of reduction, this is the idea that a person may, for example, keep the goods, but they would be entitled to some reduction for the lower quality than expected. If it's a service that you want to complain about, then we either have the right to a repeat performance. So that's where essentially the trader will redo this for free. And that's to make sure they are fixing the service and actually giving the satisfactory service that the person originally wanted. So for example, if I think my haircut is uneven, I could ask them to repeat it, redo it, and cut it so it is straight, and that would be done at no extra charge. The alternative is that you keep the service that you had, but you're entitled to a reduction, and that could be a reduction all the way down to zero so that you don't have to pay it all. So for example, if they've dyed my hair a funny colour, I might not want them to redo it. I don't trust you, so I may instead ask for the right to reduction, money off, or potentially the whole thing done for free. And it's going to very much depend on the circumstances and how big the breach was. So you've got the section numbers on here. So section 20, 23, 24 are the remedies relating to goods of the Consumer Rights Act. Sections 55 and 56 relate to services. Before you can get the remedy though, we have to look at whether the term has actually been breached, and breached just means broken. So what we have here then is that breakdown of what the expectations are when it comes to the goods and services that we buy. And again, key that you know the difference between the two, because although some of the concepts are similar, we use different terminology. So all goods that I buy from a trader must meet these minimum standards of quality. Now the standard of quality may be much better, but these are a minimum that should be there. The law is essentially the same as the Sale of Goods Act, although the sections are in a slightly different order. And that means that any case law from before 2015 still stands as valid precedent. So your cases like Grant versus Australian Knitting Mills, that would still apply, for example. So first thing is that goods we buy must be of satisfactory quality. Now that's vague. It's a test of the reasonable person and the reasonable expectation for the products that we buy. What that means is that, for example, a more expensive item is likely to have a higher expectation of quality than a cheaper item. And new goods would probably be expected to be of a better quality than second-hand goods, for example. But when it comes to the satisfactory quality, there are a number of elements that can be considered. Is it kind of generally fit for purpose, and is it durable? So does it kind of last beyond one use? Is it supposed to last beyond one use? How long would you generally expect that product to last? So for example, if you buy something from Primark, like a cheap pair of trainers, you might expect those not to last as long as a branded pair, for example, because they probably cost less. You might have a look at the appearance and finish. Are you expecting it to be absolutely spotless? So if you're buying something that's really expensive, you probably wouldn't tolerate any scratches on it, for example. That leads into minor defects as well. So again, the higher the expense, probably the higher quality you're expecting. And of course, it should be safe. Products should be safe to use. If they're not safe, then they're probably not of satisfactory quality. So again, this is kind of something that the courts or you in an exam would think about and think, would I be happy with that based on the price, for example? Now, if the trader has called attention to your defects, then you lose the right to complain, or if they're obvious as well. So for example, if there's a label on a shirt saying that the top button is missing, you can't then return it and say, this is not satisfactory quality because it doesn't have all the buttons. That was drawn to your attention and it was probably reduced because of that. Or if it was obvious, if you buy something that's obviously broken and then return it, what were you expecting? These rules are under Section 9 of the Consumer Rights Act, and they were under Section 14, subsection 2 of the Sale of Goods Act. It has to be fit for the purpose that it's sold for. And that's again, a minimum expectation that we would all have with the goods. So for example, if I buy a bottle of water, that should be safe for me to drink, for example. If I buy a waterproof jacket, I should be able to go out in the rain in it. This can be an express purpose, so maybe it's something that's on the box, or it could be something that's implied. So perhaps that you have a discussion with the sales assistant saying you're going to use it for a certain thing. It should be fit for that purpose also. So what do you think the product is usually used for? You should be able to use it for that. If you can't, then it doesn't sound like the goods are of a very good standard. That's under Section 10 of the Consumer Rights Act, Section 14.3 of the Sale of Goods Act. And the next main rule is that it must be as described. That's under Section 11 of the Consumer Rights Act and Section 13 of the Old Law, the Sale of Goods Act. Now, the description would fit packaging. So, for example, if something is described as pack of 12, it needs to have 12 in there. If a bag of crisps is marked down as 30 grams, it should have 30 grams in there. If something is labelled as suitable for vegetarian, it should be, for example, or not containing any allergens, things like that. It can also include the display model. So the display model and what you buy should usually match and have the same features. And it also covers descriptions made by staff. So if I ask if a particular set of headphones will work with my laptop and the assistant says yes, then I would be entitled to return it because it's not as described if it is incompatible. When it comes to services, the key is just that it needs to be done reasonably. Remember that and you won't go far wrong. So Section 49 of the Consumer Rights Act, or it was under Section 13 of the Old Law, the Supply of Goods and Services Act, said that all services must be done with a reasonable level of care and skill. And again, just think of it as kind of the reasonable man standard. Would a reasonable hairdresser have cut your hair like that? Would a reasonable plumber have fixed your washing machine like that? Now, again, this is going to vary depending on, for example, the price that you're paying for the service. So if you're paying for a trainee hairdresser to cut your hair, you may be satisfied with a different level of skill than perhaps the salon director. But there is still a minimum standard of care. So, for example, if the trainee hairdresser isn't paying attention and cuts all zigzags in your hair, that's not acceptable even for a trainee hairdresser. So again, it's about looking at reasonable expectations, reasonable care and skill compared to, for example, the experience of the person doing that service or the price that you're paying. Finally, it must be done within a reasonable time. And again, that's going to be a comparison with how long those sorts of things usually take. So, for example, if building a shed usually takes 2 weeks and 2 months later you're still sat there, then that could be cause for complaint. Now again, the courts would look at whether there is any particular good reason for that happening, but there is a general expectation that things should be done in a reasonable time, and that's under Section 52 of the Consumer Rights Act and Section 14 of the Supply of Goods and Services Act. Now, if you're faced with a scenario type question, simply use this almost as a flowchart to follow. First, was it goods or services that they're complaining about? Who is the relationship? Is it consumer trader or is it trader trader, for example? Once you've determined that, if it's goods or services, you know which rules you can apply. So if it's goods, do you think it was satisfactory quality based on the information that you're given? Was it fit for the purpose it had that it was sold for? And is it as described? If not, if those things are breached, then suggest a suitable remedy. If it's a service, was it done with reasonable care and skill? And was it done within a reasonable time frame? If not, you would then go on to suggest an appropriate remedy. So as long as you understand the difference between goods and services, then the rest of the pieces should fall into place. Thanks for watching.